Welcome to the Food.Life.Podcast. You are about to hear easy-to-prepare and fun-to-serve recipes plus cooking tips paired with real conversation about the issues we face every day. It's food and life. And now, here's your host, Donna Britt.
If you follow this Food Life podcast on social media, you may have seen pictures and stories from my recent trip to New York City with my creative partner, Tamby Lane. One of the highlights of our visit was a dinner at the James Beard House. James Beard was born in Portland, Oregon in 1903. He moved to New York in the 30s with plans of being a singer and actor. When that didn't work out, he opened a catering company with a friend and then published his first cookbook in 1940, which put him on the culinary map. He started the James Beard Cooking School in the 50s. He wrote many more books. He became one of the early TV food personalities. And to say the least, James Beard inspired many. After his death in 1985, Julia Child and some of his other dear friends worked to buy and preserve his New York home at 167 West 12th Street in Greenwich Village. That's where we had the dinner, and it's now North America's only historic culinary center. It's a gathering place where all of us can now appreciate the talents of emerging and established chefs, featuring hundreds of dinners and events annually. The James Beard Foundation was established in his honor to provide culinary scholarships. There are also the annual James Beard Foundation Awards honoring chefs and other culinary professionals, including journalists and authors. The foundation now supports numerous impact programs as well, which revolve around everything from sustainability to women's leadership. The mission of the foundation: to celebrate, nurture, and honor chefs and other leaders, making America's food culture more delicious, diverse, and sustainable for everyone. Their slogan, which I love: good food for good. Izabela Wojcik is the director of house programming and has been for 16 years. She's the one in charge of choosing the chefs that get to cook at the James Beard House. This is the second time I've had the pleasure of interviewing Izabela, the first time on my podcast. This conversation took place the morning after my dinner at the James Beard House, featuring Chef Kathleen Blake from the Rusty Spoon in Orlando, Florida. Kathleen's dinner was part of a series celebrating Women's History Month, featuring graduates from the Foundation's Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Program. The dinner was amazing. The experience at the Beard House overall was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Izabela is a wonderful storyteller. You'll hear us chatting about the Beard House and that dinner I got to enjoy. You'll also hear about her childhood dream, which she ended up letting go of. You'll get her pro tips for fast, nourishing family dinners, including the right salt to use. And you'll find out how food and food TV altered her rocky relationship with her father. I hope you enjoy Izabela's stories as much as I do. Thanks for listening. So, I just wanted to start by talking about the dinner, just because it was such a cool experience to be in that house and see all of James's cookbooks.
Yeah.
And
although they're not his.
So they're not?
No, we're setting the mood. So just to remind you, he had a huge debt, and when he passed away with no heirs, everything was sold at auction. So his possessions, that floor that you experience, right? The Beard House is 4 stories. The first floor has kind of this front reception room. The kitchen is sort of sandwiched in the middle, and then the greenhouse room on the other side. So all of that is, we envision it as sort of the public space, the reception space. But when he lived there, that was the cooking school, and it was the public space. Okay. So you would have been in the kitchen, the greenhouse room. At some point that was the garden, because that is where the house ended. And you can see the brick wall, and the balcony is really an outdoor balcony. So at some point that house, that was the continuation of the garden. But in James Beard's time, that garden was shortened. The greenhouse enclosure was made. And so when you took classes with him, that's the room where you would have been gathering to taste everything, to have a discussion. And the second floor was his floor through private space, which was filled with possessions. I've seen some incredible images of just, desks and chairs and sort of kimonos. And there was some sort of, a goddess statue and an antique sleigh, all these things. And then his bed was in the alcove by the window. So there wasn't like a separate bedroom. There wasn't a proper bed on the floor somewhere. It was in that alcove. So that was a private space that you would not have seen if you knew James Beard or if you were, taking a class. Right. But now that is the main dining room. But that downstairs is really a cool kind of place. So the cookbooks are really just collected through time.
Right.
Where it's nice to fill those shelves. It's nice to have that feel. To me, the Beard House experience for chefs is obviously a stage. It's a rite of passage. It represents a lot of things in terms of professional accomplishment, personal sort of satisfaction. And because it's not something you do on your own, you do it with your team, your friends, your employees, former employees. There is a shared experience that I think stays with you that gives you a sense of, I've arrived, I've accomplished something, I'm someone in the industry. From the diner's perspective, to me, when you dine there, it's more like a dinner party. It's not
for sure.
It's not like the restaurant, right?
Not at all.
You will never experience, no matter who's cooking, your experience will never be like that at their place, even if their kitchens are open. But at the same time, it's not like a catered event or a private event. It feels like a dinner party. You're seated with strangers. Hopefully you're making new friends, and that's kind of the vibe. And the books add to that sort of homey atmosphere.
It totally was that vibe. And I loved it too that Kathleen, the chef, came in after and talked about just her experience in a really down-to-earth way and introduced her team, and people asked questions, and it was just really, really special. And part of me was thinking like, it might feel uptight or stiff or pretentious or overly fancy or whatever. And it wasn't like that at all. I felt like I was in my uncle's house or something like that. That was really great. No, you guys just do a great job.
Well, your uncle's a great cook.
Yeah. No kidding. Yes. So yeah, it was just fantastic. And I just love your energy. That's why I wanted to talk to you more. And of course, talk about the Beard House and the foundation and the women's leadership program, which I think is fantastic. Kathleen was sharing some statistics last night about how many women are now in the culinary world, but how low the percentages of women who are head chefs or exec chefs, et cetera. And I just think what you're doing to promote women leadership is pretty cool.
We were initially the thinking was brought to the forefront by one of our trustees, Rohini, who owns Vermilion Restaurant in Chicago. And she's both sort of a very fierce advocate of sort of opportunities for women and how can we help in that space, and really made us aware that we had some work to do. And it sort of has snowballed into this great energy, this great program, and this great sort of, target area. So, what you just said made me realize, the conversation certainly is about how to get more women involved and visible. But the bottom line is the bottom line, which is women need to be in ownership. Women need to own things because that's where the decisions are made with money. So until they're owning things, until they are in charge and making those ultimate decisions, just having women associated and being sort of the faces of things, that's wonderful and that's great for that visibility and that awareness. But we can't really make that kind of systemic industry change until they're also in positions of power. And that's true of women, but also women of color and generally speaking, people of color.
The other thing, when I met you before and we were talking about comfort food, you're Polish and you immigrated with your family, and you were telling me about is it pierogies that you love?
It's funny. I just had some last night because my mom was visiting a couple of days ago. I actually didn't see her. She was babysitting, and then she was just being mom, like bringing laundry detergent and whatever else that she buys at bulk stores because we live in an apartment.
See, I love that. Like, and you're grown up, and you're and my kids make fun of me. They're in their 20s. They're like, really? You're bringing me things, but you do it forever, right?
Yeah, you do.
Okay, anyway.
You do. No. So I intend to be that kind of a mom. I mean, my son's 13. We're not quite there yet. But for my mom, she always will drop off some Polish food. And so I was home late last night. Everyone else had eaten. And it just seemed like, what's in the fridge? And that wasn't just like I should eat it because it's there, but also like, oh, it's raining. I came home late. Like it's going to make me feel good.
Yeah. My mommy loves me
it's
some
true to
pierogi.
stereotype. I'm eating pierogi last night with some brown butter.
But that's fantastic. But you do, but you did say, we also talked about you do cook every day. And one of my, I guess, missions is that I just want people to realize that food is accessible. They can do it. They can make healthy, nourishing food for themselves, and it doesn't have to be complicated, and it doesn't have to take a long time. So give me one of your throw together easy, fast. Here's what I do when I get home late to feed my kid.
Well, so to me, a pro tip is find a good jarred pasta sauce. Like don't just, not the cheapest or not the most expensive, but the one that you think tastes the richest, the most sort of homemade. So it's that. And then I usually enhance it with maybe some sauteed onions and some garlic powder or fresh garlic. Sometimes I throw in a package of meat. And so that's my like fast bolognese without spending Sunday hours making bolognese.
Making your sauce, right.
The oven is a wonderful tool because everything that goes in kind of cooks itself, roasts itself. So sheet pans, putting everything, a bunch of vegetables on sheet pans and starting off with like chicken thighs, chicken breasts, anything like that, tossed in olive oil, salt and pepper, put it in on a sheet pan, add some vegetables halfway through, and then you've got a whole meal that comes out on a sheet pan, and then you could just put it on the table on a trivet. I have access to fresh fish, so that cooks in 7 minutes, tops, and just a squirt of lemon juice. So those are the kinds of things I make without really thinking too hard about dinner. To me, I'm a better cook following recipes, right? So, and I'm pretty good at figuring out, is this a good recipe? Is it trustworthy? And so I will pick out recipes, and that's when I will appear to be this amazing cook. But my standard straightforward cooking is like the oven, things that cook quickly, pork chops pan-seared, chop up some apple or pear or any kind of fruit, and I saute that like almost after the pork chops are almost there. I just throw them around, maybe a drizzle of maple syrup, maybe a splash of rum or bourbon if it's just like my husband and I, and then it seems magical, and you sort of have a sauce, you've got some like fruit, and then all you need is steamed broccoli or any other like quickly steamed green vegetable, and you just drop a couple of drops of soy sauce or yuzu just to give it a little character without thinking much about it. And that's how I cook.
I think sometimes people are afraid to, or they don't know how to season their food. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I'm always encouraging those who are like, it's just like, taste it. Number one, you have to taste something. Right. And don't be afraid to put pepper on it or some salt or whatever you like,
I think that's a defining line between professional and non-professional cooks is how much salt professional cooks use. And it's kosher salt or coarse salt. It's never the fine sand sort of, powdery table salt. And I think that makes the difference is using coarse salt, not being afraid to salt things. And a little splash of lemon or a little acid. I think that's the other sort of professional side is you use those elements not to make like a lemon flavored thing or a vinegary thing, but that little drop of acid brings out the flavors. And you kind of have to know those things in order to have that come out, and I don't know that home cooks necessarily always get that message.
Right. Are you going to do a cookbook someday? Have you ever thought about doing that? Like putting together? Would you want to?
No. Short answer, no. One is just watching how tortured and demanding the process is, just being aware of chefs that do it. So just from hearing from others, no, just no. And the other thing too is, cookbooks are not just something that you get offered to do. It's such a challenging business. And I think publishers are at a position where they're trying to figure out what's going to sell. And I think those sort of vanity chef cookbooks that look beautiful on coffee tables, they're not really selling. So that's sort of out. And I think influencers are the next sort of generation of cookbook authors because they have followings. They have a unique voice. They're popular. So I feel like I don't know what, what path would I be on to be offered a cookbook, but no.
So what is something that you haven't done yet that you want to do? In the culinary world or just in life in general?
Oh my God, what a great question. So, I had a very clear vision for wanting a restaurant early on. And it had to do with, I think, coming to this country when I was 8. And that age, everything was sort of magical and happy. I think I was spared some of the pain and some of the hardship of being older and aware of what it means to leave your country or to have doubts about what you're doing. And I picked up the language without really knowing. I wasn't a native speaker. So there are hardships of being like a kid growing up that we all share, but just this idea of my experience. So America was magical, and it felt like a big adventure. And pretty quickly I fell into, seeing some catering happen. And then in high school, I had a restaurant job, and that sort of crystallized this dream. And I think the restaurant to me represented both this family idea, sort of like we all come together, we're a family, but it was the energy, the pace, the hum of a restaurant alive with diners eating. It was so joyful. And I think, what I was sensing is that idea of the joy that happens around food, around a table. And I loved the restaurant industry. And so I had a very clear vision for one day I would have a restaurant. And I pursued both education, going to the hotel school, both my jobs, trying to be sort of in the kitchen, staging, and then getting entry-level cooking jobs and kind of going up that ladder, never far, but just having enough professional kitchen to realize, well, I don't really want to be the chef of my own restaurant. I sort of want to be the personality of my own restaurant. So then switching to the front of house and getting that experience. So I had like a very clear vision for I'm collecting all of this experience that will one day enable me to have my own restaurant, and I'll know enough and I'll be ready. And then at some point I gave up that dream, and it wasn't anything dramatic. It was just, I think I realized what it takes. And I felt like I didn't want to do that in New York City. It's daunting from all the different angles, from diners' expectations to public criticism to the hardship of the lifestyle of cooking all those hours and the uncertainty of even staying in business long enough. Like all of that suddenly made me realize I don't want to own a restaurant. I want to be a regular in a restaurant. So then it's like, all right, now what? And my dream was so clear.
Do you get paid for being a regular?
Well, maybe an influencer. I don't know. But I had such a clear vision. I practically had my furniture picked out that when I decided like I'm honestly not interested in that, I was left with this like blank space of now what am I doing? And so luckily, one of the mentors I had was Michael Ginor, and he's the founder of Hudson Valley Foie Gras, and basically saved my life from the like, what am I doing now? By giving me an opportunity to come work for him. And Hudson Valley Foie Gras at the time was just like the hottest ingredient. It had a cult following. Every chef felt like he or she needed, mostly he, but needed to have a signature foie gras dish. So I came around at a time when it was like great to be in the foie gras business. It was exciting. And so for, over 3 years, it was an opportunity to work with a lot of chefs through that particular ingredient, but also to go into cooking schools. I did a lot of events for James Beard Foundation. I had an early foot in the door there anyway with, just odd jobs and volunteering in the kitchen, that it suddenly became like I'm the perfect person once an opportunity became available to be part of programming, to be part of sort of the culture of the foundation. So now that was 16 years ago. So during that time, honestly, it's been a charmed life of opportunities to both, when chefs, so just speaking from my perspective right now as my job, right? So I get to invite chefs to cook at the Beard House, and it's not a magic wand or only people I like. It's nothing personal, but it's about, who you are right now cooking, what's your message, what's your food, but what's your community, what's your context, and, how does that fit onto a James Beard House stage, and what will that experience be like? And I have to do that 200 times. But it's such a privilege, what I witness is chefs who either aspire to cook there or have cooked there and want to sort of share that with a new team, and just want to support us, want to be part of our mission. So I get to witness, other people's sort of dreams kind of manifesting at the Beard House, which is, that never gets old. It feels really special. And sure, it's just dinner, but it's so much more than just dinner, right? So there's that. But through my experiences, I've gotten to judge food competitions. I've gotten to travel to both either represent James Beard Foundation, or in my sort of professional hat, I'm checking out food festivals. I'm meeting chefs. I'm looking at what is the dining scene of a particular town or place, just so I'm familiar. I don't need to travel for my living, right? So it's not about I go, I taste, and if I think it's good enough, then I invite that to the Beard House, because it's not restaurant criticism.
Right.
And it's not saying this is the best lamb in all the land. It's really about the chefs and what they're doing and their stories and how does that translate to New York. But so what else could I do, right? I think I'm still waiting to decide what I want to do when I grow up. It feels a bit like that.
Yeah.
I think, I'm very much interested in learning. So where can I learn more about this industry? The things that I haven't done are things like, spend time on farms or with fishermen, or go and have those kinds of experiences of what it's like to procure the food. So I've spent time in professional kitchens. I've certainly eaten in magnificent restaurants, and I'm happy to do that every day, honestly. But I love having a family that also focuses me on what's important and allows me to prioritize. Life in New York City makes you feel like no matter what you're doing, you've missed everything else that you didn't do because you made that one decision. It just feels like when you commit to the one thing, you just hear about all the other things. So that's a little bit of like the FOMO of life in New York. And I don't want that to be my distraction. I don't want that to be the thing that guides me. Like I have to keep doing more and more and more. So I love having, being a mom and having a family that forces me to prioritize like what's really important professionally and what's really important personally. I did once have a brief sort of flirtation with being a professional hugger, because I thought connecting to people, kind of getting that sense of who they are, delivering a little bit of that like positive energy. It's never inappropriate. It's never weird. It's like just a wonderful way to connect to somebody. And I was like, can I make money hugging people? And my friends were like, yeah, that doesn't sound good.
No, I'd be in for that. I would start that business with you. So, is your son, does he care that you know all of this about food and that you're into food? Like, is he into it too? Or does he just thinking like, I'm hungry, what can I eat, Mom?
No, I think he's into it, but he's first of all, he's a guy and a jock, and he's middle school, which is rough, just coming out of 8th grade. So it's not cool to sort of care, know? So I think he's having that teenage experience. When he was much younger, he was at a nursery school near the Beard House. And so I would pick him up and then we'd go back to the Beard House. I'd introduce him to the chefs. He'd get a cookie inevitably. And it was exciting. And I do have envy, speaking from that time when I really wanted a restaurant and I know what that sort of yearning was like. I've always envied kids who grew up in restaurants. I know it's not ideal. You give up certain things, but this idea of you get this community, this exciting place that's sort of humming and thriving, and just, professional kitchens are not warm and fuzzy like a home kitchen. It's more like an auto body shop. There's stuff happening. It's a lot of metal and it's noisy, but at the same time, I think it's the people that make it interesting. And then there's yummy treats like wherever you look. So I've always sort of had this fantasy, like what's it like to have, a kid where he or she has to come home and, not home, but like home to your restaurant home, right. And sort of do homework at one of the tables, and helps out in the kitchen. I've always thought what a charmed life to sort of grow up that way. So we experienced that early on when he was little, but then we live in Brooklyn. And so then right. He was there. So I will say that he now expresses very sort of particular preferences, because I think some of it is what his friends are like it's a lot of social pressures to be a certain way. And he sort of keeps throwing in my face like fast food is better, because I just always cooked everything he ate. There was never fast food. It just wasn't even, it wasn't a righteous path. It was more like,
it wasn't even on the radar.
It just wasn't on the radar, and I think my friends were like, have you ever thought about ordering in a pizza? And it just dawned on me, like, I don't think I've ever ordered in a pizza. Like he goes to people's houses and they order in a pizza, but I didn't even do that, So now it's like, oh, I think I'll just go to, this chain or whatever. So, but he knows how to be in a restaurant. He knows how to eat. He happily orders off a menu and isn't nervous about liking it or not liking it. And one of my favorite stories, and I still don't understand why, he lifelong hates mushrooms. And I have snuck them into things, and I've tested this theory with a variety of different mushrooms. And he's kindly each time eaten a bite and told me there's a mushroom in here, and I'm just going to remind you I don't like mushrooms. So he's confident in that. But we were somewhere, it was a very farm to table restaurant. Everything was grown on the premises, and he wanted pasta. And the only pasta was fettuccine with wild mushrooms. And he decided to order it. And I said to him, listen, there's not much in this dish besides herbs and olive oil, but it's really mushrooms. And you don't like mushrooms, so there's not much there. And he's like, that's okay. I'll eat around. It's the love of pasta won over the mushrooms.
Give me the noodles.
Which he totally ignored.
That's awesome.
Which I took home. And this is my passive aggressive way of I'm not going to waste food, and can't, are you, do you really not like mushrooms? I stuck them back into a frittata breakfast sandwich burrito situation. And he didn't say anything, but he had mushrooms again.
I've just warmed up to mushrooms in recent years. I wasn't always a mushroom fan, but there was a really nice, last night, one of her dishes had this lovely big sliced mushroom that was really good. It's really delicious. So on the podcast, we talk about food a lot, and we also talk about life. And what's a hard thing that you've had to navigate through that is an experience that you would want to share, just something that you got through, and it was just the healing power of love and family and food that got you through it, and that's something that you are willing to talk about. Anything come to mind?
Well, so there are a few things, actually. The one that, it's been my relationship with my father. I'll say that's the one. And of course, then my mom too. But the one with my father was, I think, the most sort of allowed me to grow, sort of change, expanded my thinking. It's been an interesting thing to witness. So I came to this country. I didn't know my father until I met him in this country. So he had come first. He had opportunities to, we were living in Poland, right? So this was communist Poland in the 60s. He was a teacher at a trade school on construction, and was getting jobs, sort of, I guess, there were opportunities to get construction jobs in Egypt and in Libya in those times, which tells me that it was cheaper to bring in Polish workers than to hire locals.
Right.
And the kind of construction that was being done was very basic, basic structures, hospitals, schools, just housing units, things like that. So he would get a contract, be sent on one of these projects for a few months, and then come back to Poland, and then, look for another contract like that. So he was doing that, and then had heard he had family in Miami, and sort of made that decision that he was going to try to get to America. So this was 1968. At some point, he made that decision and then left. And so that meant that hardship of going through Italy and Spain and Europe and getting to America and getting to Miami and learning that he did have relatives, but it was it was so many generations removed that they didn't really speak Polish. They didn't know who he was. He just didn't find family in Miami and ended up in New York. So at the same time he made that decision to leave, my mom learned she was pregnant. And it's like, oh, great, he's gone, and here I am. And so I was born in 1969. And then it was that process, my father kind of making that promise to send for my mom. And it took 8 years. So I was 8 to get a green card. And it was all just, bureaucracy and the fact that he couldn't come back because he had left illegally. Finally, we had green cards, and finally we got to America, and I was 8. So that was the first time I met my father at the airport. And I'd never spoken to him. We didn't have a telephone growing up. So it was letters, photographs, postcards, gifts, right?
Just that in itself.
Yeah, think about that.
You know what I mean?
As an adult, what that might be like. But so from my perspective, my dad was a guy, in stories. And the photographs were from Egypt and Libya. So it was like a man on a camel or with Arabic writing. It seemed exotic and just like not meaningful at all to a kid. Like, okay, that's your father. So at the airport, it was just like this strange, like, okay, here he is, and he'd never had a child, like a baby in his life. And so I was the first, thing. And he never had a baby. It was like an 8-year-old girl manifested. So we had a strained relationship early on because he wanted a son. He was like a burly construction guy, very rough, an alcoholic, a chain smoker. And my mom was much more refined and intellectual. And I think for her, coming to America meant giving up this identity that she really enjoyed. And I've always felt sorry for her because she gave up so much.
Her life.
To do this, whereas like I didn't. And my father sort of had opportunities and a betterment, which was not easy, of course, but that's she enjoyed, the fact that for 8 years, he worked in America, sent dollars back, and he was working construction. He was working in a factory that manufactured index cards, manila folders, like paper office goods. So it was like an old-fashioned like factory. So working with his hands, kind of very blue collar, but he was sending dollars back. And in communist Poland, foreign currency was the only thing that gave you access to a better life, because Polish money could only be used in like the state stores, which didn't have anything to offer. So foreign currency of any kind, including dollars, meant you got to go into like the foreign currency stores where it was Levi's jeans and Marlboro cigarettes and Jack Daniels or Johnny Walker, whatever. But it was like all of the luxury goods that were, American or foreign that gave you sort of a luxurious lifestyle. They were sold in these stores. And so my mom had access. She had a great independent job. She traveled a lot. My grandparents were raising me. She was always present nights and weekends whenever she wasn't traveling. And so I don't feel like my mom wasn't there. She was very much a part of my life. But she was this beautiful, well-dressed woman with like fancy friends, And then we come to America. She doesn't speak the language. She can only get jobs sort of like in factories or cleaning houses. So she's reduced to being a person that she's really not, but this is now her life in America. So she suffered greatly. I was 8, so it was an exciting adventure. And my relationship with my dad was sort of like, I don't know if I like him. I don't know him, and he's not like fun. And I'm a girl. Like, I don't know, So that's where we started. And he wanted, and I think my parents had that dream for me of being a doctor or lawyer. Like, they toiled. We all worked 3 jobs together so I could be a doctor or lawyer in America. And I was not interested at all, even though I had great grades. But it was that interest in restaurants and people. One of my favorite memories is a place that we lived from the time I was in 3rd grade. I mean, I arrived in 3rd grade and it was shortly after. So maybe by the end of 3rd grade through the first year of high school, we lived in a place called the Polish National Home. And it was essentially like a members club for the Polish community. But they also had, a bar, a billiard table, a TV, a cigarette machine, so the members could kind of hang out. And then they had 3 different sized rooms to rent for occasions and events. And so there's a big ballroom with a stage and a piano, and there are 2 smaller rooms. And we lived there. We had an apartment on top as the sort of supers. So while my parents worked their various factory jobs, they also were responsible for taking care of this place, which meant I had odd jobs around the place. Things like filling the cigarette machine with the cigarettes, or, clipping all the potato chip bags behind the bar, or combining all the bottles, all the half bottles of like Canadian Club into one. So it was just kind of being around a bar and then helping all the caterers coming and going, setting up, showing them where things were, and just taking care of this place. So I grew up in this place that was just full of events. I worked the coat room for every wedding, and the ballroom was just a big square room, and there's a window in one of the walls, and it was just my window into their wedding, into their festivities. And so it was this really magical place, right? So that's very formative years. And I started to be interested in food and cooking. I got a restaurant job. And it just sort of set me on this path to wanting to go to cooking school. And my parents were devastated. I mean, I don't even know how I learned about cooking schools, because this was the mid 80s and nobody talked about cooking schools. They're basically trade schools. It was interesting to be an immigrant, to be the only one of my friends interested in food and restaurants and wanting to go to cooking school. And I felt very isolated in that decision. And my parents were, of course, devastated that this is what was happening.
They came all the way over here, sacrificed everything, and you wanted to go to cooking
and
school.
It wasn't a noble profession anywhere, not even in Poland. Right. You know, it was, you would toil somewhere in basements in sort of medieval conditions. Like, that was not a job you wanted, even there, you know. So the compromise was to go pursue, hotel school and business school. And that's fine. And I did that. And then suddenly I was working in hotels and I didn't like doing that. But so this is a long-winded way to say, you know, I was on a path my parents didn't understand, and my father especially could not relate to, because cooking was sort of like what women did, you know, like he would come home and expect to be fed, expect a hot meal on the table. And I always joked with my mom that he could come home, sit at the table, and if dinner was on the stove, he'd starve to death, because the idea of like even crossing the kitchen to pick that up was beyond him, right? So it was always this running joke, like, I mean, you practically have to feed the man, otherwise the poor thing would starve. So he really didn't understand. It was like beyond his conception what I was interested in. I go off, you know, in my 20s, I leave high school, you know, I move out, I go to college, and then I'm on this path, I'm working in restaurants. And my father discovered food television.
Oh, yeah.
And it was Martha Stewart, and it was Jacques Pepin, and it was a few other cooks. And suddenly this man who didn't understand a thing about me is interested in food for the first time. And the first sort of like, this was a happy, joyful experience. But I just remember there's like this line, one Thanksgiving, my mom was, and Thanksgiving was sort of like, we adopted Thanksgiving, right? It's not a Polish tradition in any way. And we always forgot the cranberry sauce in the can, in the fridge, because we didn't even know you're supposed to eat it together. So we would buy it a couple of weeks before and then forget to put it on the table every year. We're like, oh, the cranberry sauce. So one year it was like stovetop potatoes, because we thought they were better, like out of potato flakes out of a box. And like frozen broccoli with a cheese sauce, which is delicious, but it is like from the bag, right? And the cranberry sauce from the can and the turkey. And the next year, my father is making like a leg of lamb and the turkey, and he's made his own ice cream. He bought an ice cream machine, is making his own ice cream, and asked me if I could make a risotto. Like, it was such a difference, you know, just 1 year and his world being opened. And so we went from having a really hard, strained relationship where, you know, he was never physically abusive, but very verbally abusive about, you know, how long I was a grade A student. I loved studying. I loved school. And he thought that meant that I was slow and challenged because I spent so much time studying. So it's that kind of not understanding. And the fact that he seemed very disappointed in my career choices and just like my life path. And suddenly food becomes the language in which we can communicate. And I always thought my father was sort of this, you know, sort of like not interesting, not intellectual, nothing going on upstairs kind of a guy. And my mom was clearly the like exotic, sort of European, well-traveled, beautifully put together woman, the creative sort of energy. And I envisioned my parents in those roles and I kept them there. And it wasn't until later on, after my father passed away, so I'll get to that point, that I realized my father was actually much more whimsical, much more sort of an artist that didn't realize he was that. Like, he was trapped doing construction. He was trapped sort of being obligated to be a certain way. He had come out of a very small village, you know, where alcoholism was rampant. There's a lot of mental illness that ran on that side of the family. And I think he just didn't have a construct that would allow him to really be who he could be. So he was like what he was. And my mom was much more conservative in her thinking, much more sort of sensitive to public opinion and what's the right way to do things. I just didn't realize that what I loved about myself and how I viewed myself as this sort of like creative, free spirit, like cuckoo bird, that actually is all my father. and I didn't recognize that until later. And so the painful sort of childhood, high school memories get a little bit turned around when we start to kind of communicate through food, which then continued for the rest of his life. And then, when Luca was probably 5 years old, he was diagnosed with cancer, hadn't suffered. It was just a very random thing. And then suddenly there he was with cancer. And 6 months later, he was gone. And he had never, my dad, didn't suffer. So that's lucky. And it seemed like a shame. Like the saddest thing about it all for me was that he really wouldn't experience my son beyond like the 5 years. Like he really just wouldn't see what happened to him. And I felt terrible that he was really robbed of that. Like he didn't have that with me, and he really wasn't going to have that with his grandson. And then the other thing is it felt like, I think I was still holding on to resentment and anger. And even though we had been getting along really well, it's like, do I love him? Do I miss him? Do I not? Like I had to think about these feelings. And I just decided that what I needed to do was sort of forgive him, for the way that he treated me, how he thought of me. I can blame him for some things, but in the end, he did the best he could. And it was time. It was like time to just let it all go and sort of put the emotions away and just sort of see him clearly for who he was, and sort of that is sort of life, food, and death all in one, know. So it's been interesting. So now I have my mom, and it's an evolving relationship. I am,
It is.
I think the thing that I cannot learn, that I continue to sort of not understand, that I'm still not learning this, is that she will not be different. I think I have these great
acceptance,
right? I have these great expectations, like, oh, she'll be like this, and then we'll do this, and it just isn't. And I keep trying over and over. So maybe I'm not ready to learn that lesson yet, and maybe that's why I still have her in my life, and I love that. But she is also the person that has left me with some gifts, and one that I'm really proud of, that's like small and silly, but not so much, that I remember even in school, is willing to go out of your way for someone else. Just there's no limit. Like the strain with my mom and I is that there's no limits to what I will do for you. And that's a heavy burden. And she does things like makes herself comfortable in my home. She like rearranges things. She leaves her things like hidden so that they're not in my way and I don't get annoyed, but it's her things that are there. So it's a little like creeping into my life. But in her mind, it's that you will go to any distance to help your child, your neighbor, your friend.
My son makes fun of me if what was it? Something the other day. And he said, "Oh, I like that, Mom." And I go, "Oh." And usually if he said, "Oh, I like that," I would say, "Oh, here, do you want it?" I mean, I'll just take my shirt off and give it to you. But there was something that we were talking about, and he sat there for a second. He goes, You mean you're not going to offer that to me?" He goes, "You always offer it to me." But it's because I know how your mom feels. Yeah. It's like, oh, well, I'll do anything. And it annoys my kids too. They get super annoyed.
So the first realization I had that I think was my, growing up, so from Poland to the suburbs of, New York, Long Island. And I remember not being offered a ride home from a friend's mom because they lived like in the other direction, half a mile. Yeah. And I lived in the other direction half a mile. So it wasn't really far. Right. But it was this idea like, oh, well, we're not going that way, so you can walk. And I remember thinking my mom would drive the whole school home if allowed. Like nothing was out of her way, And even now, it's like your mom. I love my mom for that. Even now, it's like, oh, if you have to work late, even after midnight, I'm still going to come and I'll drive home at 2 a.m. because there's no traffic. I don't mind. So it's silly, but on the other hand, it's this generosity that I find is really important to have. And I think it's what there are so many interactions I have with people, and I'm so judgmental in my mind, of course. I try to be very polite outwardly, but in my mind. And I realize it comes down to the fact that they were not trained. They weren't given those opportunities. That you can't always take it so personally about why don't they realize, don't they see, don't they know? Yeah. I was really lucky to be to have that instilled in me, that generosity,
So you get to pass it on.
Exactly.
You'll be annoying your son for the rest of his life, going out of your way to do
guilting
things for him
every step of the way. But yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Of course. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah.
It's been an honor.
Izabela Wojcik, from the James Beard House in New York City. There is a bit more to our conversation, which you'll get to hear in our next episode, episode 10, Borders, Boundaries, and Braised Pork Bowl. Izabela will share her unique views on immigration, which I find especially poignant considering she herself is an immigrant. So I hope you'll join us for that one. See more, hear more, find out more as usual at Food.Life.Pod.com and look for us on social media at Food.Life.Pod. Thanks again. Talk to you next time.